Robert, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Greg.
My pleasure. What is happening on today's world stage? Where do you see the shifts in power, and what is that going to be, or what's going to be the end results or the unexpected end results in the terms of technology, banking that we cannot even think about at this stage?
Pretty broad question to get started on.
I know, I'd like to warm you up nice and easy.
Exactly. Look, I think what we're seeing geopolitically at the moment is the culmination of tensions that have been building up for probably the last couple of decades.
Okay.
And the reality is, irrespective of what people think about how the Trump administration is going about things, I think you've got to take a step back and think about why. Right?
Yeah, good question.
And the why is, I think, fundamentally, even since 2016, the US was starting to signal on a bipartisan level that they were concerned about China. And they were concerned about China geopolitically, and they were concerned about the terms of trade with China. And you saw the first set of tariffs that were implemented by the first Trump presidency that were carried on by Biden.
Yes.
I think the reality is, if you're a sort of student of history, you can look at the last, the post-world era as actually an anomaly, which we all benefited personally from, growing up in an era of globalization, of largely peace.
Mm-hmm.
But that's coming to an end. And whether you believe in the thesis of rising power, falling power, whether that's reality or perception, you've got two superpowers that feel that their time, is now.
Mm-hmm.
And that's definitely creating economic and geopolitical tensions. I think layered on top of that, I think there's consensus in the US that the middle class has been hollowed out. Now, again, whether the true reason for that is globalization, the US voters have consistently voted in a government that has made that narrative.
Very true.
I think there's another issue around defense spending. Again, the Americans would claim consistently, particularly around NATO, that European countries haven't spent enough. And they would argue, we've sort of mentioned this politely for 15, 20 years, and now we're going to be more direct.
Yep.
Right? So I think that's where we're at. Now, beyond that, I think as you move out of an era of globalization and geopolitical detente to a multipolar world, to a world where security risks are increasing, there's an imperative to enhance, secure your physical and technology infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
And so wherever we are in the next 3 years on trade deals, on economics, I think everyone has to accept that the world will be bipolar from an infrastructure and technology perspective.
Okay. Can we protect ourselves from that?
So,
or is it just going to be?
I think we have to, right? And let's define the we. I think I'm from the UK. You're Australian.
Yeah.
When we talk about the we, we're really talking about the Western aligned countries.
Yep.
And I think people sometimes talk about these issues as if there's a choice. I don't think there's a choice. And one reason we set up Serendipity Capital in 2019 is we believed that we were going into a multi-decade Cold War.
Okay.
And that Western governments and large corporations had not invested enough in securing their physical and technology infrastructure. And actually, although the world didn't need another venture capital firm, most venture capital firms had spent their time investing in the consumer internet or NFTs or cryptocurrencies. Interesting, but largely banal things. And there was a significant underinvestment in the technologies that would defend the countries that we all love.
So, look,
And yeah, sorry.
well, just on the technologies then. So you've got, as you said, you've got the power play at the moment between the US, obviously, and China. And you've seen Trump encourage an enormous investment now in energy for the data rooms and everything else, which is going to allow AI to be full maximum.
Yeah.
But that's in a race, I guess, against the Chinese. From your perspective and knowing this market far better than I do, who's actually leading in the
Yeah.
space in AI and in quantum at this particular point? That's my first question.
Yeah.
Has the world as business considered this in depth enough, which is to your point?
Yeah.
Third part to it, in 5 years' time, what's the unexpected that we haven't thought about in this space that
Yeah.
could impact us?
So who's leading is a complex question because there is an equal transparency, right? And so the amount of scientific research the West publishes versus China publishes is two different levels. So anyone who says they really know where China is probably, exaggerating how much they know.
Sure.
But I think if you read broadly, you would sort of say consensus is in AI and quantum, the West and particularly the US is leading. How far that gap is, no one really knows.
Right. Okay.
And I think we're in an era that everyone has to be sort of healthily paranoid. Like, this is not an era of complacency. Okay. So even if you are ahead, you've got to invest. You've got to invest and you've got to make sure that you are developing the new solutions as quickly as possible.
Okay.
In terms of corporations, how they're adopting it, I think it varies, and I'll use quantum because that's even more of an emerging technology than AI. I think it's hard to find a company that doesn't say that they're adopting AI or machine learning in some form into their business model. But if you take something like quantum, actually, when I was at CBA in 2013, CBA made its first quantum investment alongside the Australian federal government and Telstra. Okay. So some of the financial institutions and telcos have been thinking about this over, even 10, 15 years ago. If you take the US, JP Morgan have, I think, 30 or 40 quantum PhDs working for them full time. They've invested $100 million into Quantinuum.
Right, okay.
So the large corporations are starting to invest because they know these technologies are coming and they have to keep abreast of it. Now, how far and how broad is the adoption? Probably not enough. And I think the next 5 years, people will have to accelerate their knowledge and their adoption. What you're starting to see, the US has done it, the UK have definitely done it, I'm not sure about Australia, is governments are now coming out and saying, you have to be quantum ready by 2033. Right? So that's started. I think the really interesting thing is sort of where are we all going to be in 5 years?
Yeah.
And clearly there's some huge positives, right? AI will drive productivity. Right? It will drive, knowledge and information. It will drive better decision making. There's a genuine concern about labor. Does it create significant levels of unemployment? How do governments, how do societies deal with that? With quantum, people talk often about cybersecurity.
Yes.
But actually, the biggest impact will probably be in health, human health. Because what quantum effectively does is it allows a significant amount of computations far in excess of classical computing. So whenever you've effectively got a code, it's highly effective in cracking that code. Now, the read across to cybersecurity is clear, but the read across to drug discovery is also going to be profound. And so the combination of quantum and AI could well mean that our kids on average live, over 100 years. So there's going to be huge benefits. But again, there are risks. Whoever gets to quantum supremacy first will potentially be able to unlock all the security of a competing nation. And so all these technologies, they always sort of are a double-edged sword. Hugely beneficial to society, but potentially disruptive.
What's got to get done, Rob, to make sure you are quantum ready?
So the technology has to mature. So the industry is in a process of probably a 5-year journey where you will start to, by 27 to 29, you will start to have hardware that will be able to run algorithms that will have meaningful commercial impact. And the largest and the sort of arguably the best hardware companies are saying by 2031, 2033, they will achieve quantum supremacy. Now, that seems like a long time away, but when you think about the iPhone and you think that it didn't exist in 08, 09,
Yes,
how fundamentally it's changed our lives, these changes come quickly, and they change businesses and they change individual habits and how we live our lives.
And the labour point, it's nice that your kids are going to be living to over 100 years old.
Yeah.
Not a lot of fun. Not a lot of fun if they're unemployed up to 105 or whatever the case is going to be.
Yeah.
What is the work going to be for the future then?
I don't know, but increasingly, I mean, when we grew up, when we went into the workplace,
yeah, we had the same old thing.
The knowledge was the most important moat you had as an individual.
Yes.
So what's technology doing? It's making that freely available. First came Google, now comes OpenAI. Knowledge is no longer a moat. So then the question is, what are the tasks people can do that aren't replaced by robots, aren't replaced by a pure knowledge moat? Right. And I've read quite interesting theories that actually it's all in the creative arts, right? It's all in those areas that actually potentially humans can play a really interesting role, right? And you're sort of starting to see the early signs, not driven by AI, but you would have heard about these trends that increasingly people want experiences. When they spend money, right, they don't really want assets as much anymore. They want experiences.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think all these technologies will drive people to that. You can't replicate being at the SCG at Ashes game, right?
No, you certainly can't.
Yeah, and I say that grudgingly as a Brit. It's been a painful experience, but you can't replicate that. And so I think people are creative. Industries will be formed. I mean, when I was growing up, there was no such thing as influencer. There was no such thing as people making a living off YouTube. The problem's going to be, how do you transform millions of people from traditional work? And there, I really think it's going to be a problem. And often the issue isn't, it's easy to sort of analyze where we are today, talk about a future end state. All the opportunity and the pain is in the transition, right? it sort of takes us back to the geopolitical point. We can all imagine a world where it's a little bit like pre the Berlin Wall coming down, right? The West you sort of move between that ecosystem. The Chinese have their ecosystem. Actually, people were happy in 1988. Right? People got on with it. You just went to certain countries on holiday and you didn't really think about other countries. The problem is the transition from A to B, right? That's where all the risk is. That's where potentially there's opportunity. So I think it's not clear how that transition happens. It's not clear, are large corporations ready for it? It's not clear that governments are ready for it. Now, to be fair, it's not clear how quickly the transition happens.
Right, yeah, okay.
And is it 3 years or is it 10 years?
On AA, Robert, I did a conversation a couple of weeks ago,
Yeah.
and it was sort of put to me, imagine if our level of intelligence is between, say, average of 100 IQ to 150 being, I think, genius.
Yeah.
But we create machines at 200, 300, 500, 700, 1,000 in terms of intellect. What happens there?
Yeah. So,
And is that going to happen?
yeah, I mean, look, there are two schools of thought on this, right? There's the school of thought which is we will always control the machines, and then there's the other school of thought which is the Hollywood, the machines
the science fiction
take
ones.
over.
Yep.
Right? Yeah, Terminator or whatever
Yep.
movie you'd like to pick.
Is that outrageous?
I think you could see that as a possibility. I don't think it's anytime soon, but I wouldn't put it at zero probability.
Okay.
I think the short-term issue, which is starting to merge with, say, large language models, right, is this concept of hallucinations. And so when you've got these models that are running off mass data and they're extrapolating to outcomes, it's not always, they're starting to find that occasionally it's not extrapolating to the right answer.
Oh, right, okay.
Right. Now, that's not, that in itself can be a problem short, medium term. So when you go on Perplexity or OpenAI and you ask it a question, people are looking at their answer and assuming it's right. But what if it's not? Right?
Yeah.
And these models are black boxes. So before we get to the Terminator type issue, there's a whole bunch of actually more mundane issues that exist with these large language models. Now, they're investing billions of dollars. They're trying to improve them. But there's a way to go. There's a way to go. And the other thing I would say about large language models is they are trained by humans. So, we've seen over the last 10 years accusations of bias, particularly across social media companies.
Yes.
So the other risk with these things are, do people put bias in the answers? Right? And that can be really dangerous. So there's also the emergence of what's been called large signal models, where they just are trained off data. Right? That's it.
Okay.
And, there's starting to be a view that might actually be the answer, not the large language models that people have been very focused on. I mean, that's a emerging debate. I wouldn't say that's a consensus view. But people like Meta, the chief scientist of Meta, has recently come out and said, look, we're not sure about these large language models, and we're not sure that they're going to be the stepping stone to AGI. So you're starting to get very prominent people come out and sort of say, look, as these things emerge, we see the opportunities, we see the use cases, but we also see the issues in terms of how they're developing.
So which corporates are taking the lead in this space?
In terms of AI,
Hmm.
I mean, as you would assume, the large tech companies are
Yep.
absolutely adopting it into their business model, be it Microsoft or Amazon or Meta. Uh, I think banking is also, often a very relatively quick adopter of these technologies. And there's ample opportunity because when you look at businesses or even government, like banks and governments are quite similar institutions in the sense that they're big bureaucracies that largely deal with confidential information
Yep.
and they make big payments, right?
Hmm.
A lot of what that bureaucracy is around security, around verification, confirmation things are right. A lot of that can be impacted by AI. You know, so the really interesting thing, Greg, in an era of large government
Yep.
all around the West, right, where governments have got bigger, 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 public sector employees have been the growth driver of employment.
That's going to have to change, isn't it?
It's going to have to change, but are they going to be a quick adopter of AI? Right, that's going to be a really interesting question. And again, put aside how they've done it, but actually the Trump administration with Elon Musk coming in Doge, I wouldn't claim that they've executed perfectly, but the intent of driving world-class technology into the government bureaucracy
Yep.
to drive productivity for taxpayers
Yep.
has to be the right intent.
Yep. Yeah, they're talking up to what, 23%, aren't they?
Yeah. Yeah. Now,
And
whether will they do it, how long will it take? That's all open to, to debate. But I think all governments will have to adopt this.
okay, so there's going to be natural resistance to start with, but it's not
Yeah.
going to be sustainable. It just can't be.
It can't be. It
Otherwise,
can't.
you're going to be behind before you know it.
Yeah. And also, um, a lot of countries have sort of ended up with a model where there's never enough money and the only solution is to raise taxes,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And that leads to a lack of investment and a lack of productivity, and so then the question is, how do you solve that? And AI and technology is the answer.
How do you fuel it? So that's the other big thing, isn't it? Energy.
Yeah, so often people talk about an AI strategy. In the UK currently there's big debates about an industrial strategy, and those are absolutely critical if you're taking a 10-year view on the country. But they don't work without an energy strategy, right? Because ultimately, if you want to deliver security for your citizens,
Which is the number one thing that all governments must do or should
must
do.
do.
Yeah.
And this is where I sort of opened with some of these things aren't optional. They're a necessity. What do you have to do? You have to deliver safety. You have to deliver energy security. You have to deliver food security for your citizens.
Yes.
Right? And if you have low cost energy, then you can have data centers. And if you have great data centers, you can have a leading AI capability. If you have low cost energy, you can run manufacturing in a productive cost effective way. Because the biggest input into these things are energy. Right?
Yep.
And so I think a lot of governments in the West we use the word transition, right? Energy transition to net zero. But actually, given where geopolitics is, there's a real need to have very mature, multifaceted long-term energy strategies.
And consistent levels of energy.
Consistent levels of energy, robust security around energy delivery. And it's not about one form. There's a place for renewables. There's a place for gas. There's a place for nuclear. Right?
Yeah.
But the reality is it has to be balanced. We live in a world where, put aside the nationality, but trawlers have been going around the world cutting undersea cables. So if people think offshore wind is the only solution, how are you going to protect it from a hostile person who takes them all out?
It's an easy thing to do, right?
Yeah. So there's always, there has to be mature conversations about these things and a balanced approach. And I think in a lot of countries, we're not there yet,
And the form of energies that you talked about, I understand that. What about the rare earths? Is that going to come into play somewhat more?
No, it's there today. It's critical, right? It's critical for EVs, for a number of industries that are going to become really important. And this is where Australia is so wonderfully positioned. Right?
Really? We're sitting on a lot. We've got so much opportunity.
Yeah.
Come on, you're a banker, and I think you know how to invest.
Yes.
You think we've got a strategy?
Yeah. So lucky country, right? So
Very lucky.
you've got food security.
Yep.
You've got energy security.
Yeah, we've got good borders in the sense of sea
you've
all
got
around.
rare earths that everyone needs.
Yep.
But you've got to refine those rare earths, right? You can't just ship them to China. So, to be fair to the government, setting up the NRF, the National Reconstruction Fund, to look at supply chain, to look at bringing refining capability back in-house into Australia. These are long-term investments, but they are critical.
Mm.
So I think all of that absolutely is right. The potential of Australia, its growing population, it's enormous. I mean, Australia should be the richest country in the world per capita. But as you know, there are productivity issues, there are high tax issues. There's a disincentive to invest.
Yep.
There's a disincentive to take risk. And you would have heard from so many people on your podcast that people respond to incentives.
Absolutely.
And people particularly respond to tax incentives. And the tax policy is really clear. Buy a third home, don't invest in innovation.
That's the message, isn't it?
Yeah. And people are rational and they're smart and they do what the incentives tell them to do, which is what they've been doing. So all the natural assets are there, but the incentives aren't quite there yet to take advantage of it. And in a world of a bipolar, multipolar world, Australia plays such an important role for Southeast Asia, for the US, for Five Eyes, alongside Canada, because they are the energy-rich, food-secure economies that can produce excess. Right?
Well, we don't hear this. We don't hear the narrative thinking more than 3 years ahead.
Yeah.
You talked a little bit there, but I mean, that's been almost off the back of the fag pack in some cases. We're sitting on opportunity galore, but you talk about refining. We can't even have enough oil refined in this country to last more than a month because that's offshore.
Yeah, and that's hard, right? And I think you've just had an election over the weekend.
We have, yep.
And when I lived in Australia, I mean, it was really noticeable. If you have a 3-year political cycle, probably 12, 15 months after the election, it starts again, right? Because particularly when I lived in Australia, 2011 to 18, the Liberals had so many and Labor had so many leaders, right? Like coups within the political party. So there's constant, like almost internal focus versus 10, 15-year strategies.
So nothing, just so you know, nothing's changed. Now, as an investor, If you had, let's do a hypothetical. If you had the opportunity, if we flew you down on the plane tomorrow night, and you came down, you had to sit down with the cabinet, the new constructed cabinet. What would you suggest to them? Like, how can we prosper from all this opportunity that we have?
But I think, what's realistic? I think what's realistic is entities that are being set up that have long-term investment mandates, like the Future Fund,
Yep.
like NRF.
Yep.
Don't politicize them, right?
Yep.
Because they need to invest for the long term without the threat of repercussions or, they're
Political
there for
persuasion.
purpose.
Yep.
Yeah, they're there for purpose. I mean, at the end of the day, tax policy is really important. People have to have a real incentive to invest, whether it's corporations in R&D, whether it's individuals. The superannuation system is a real gift, right? On a global basis, it's a remarkable policy. It's set up Australia really well.
Yeah, it certainly has.
But and this is a little bit unfair, so I'm saying it for dramatic effect. But what is it? What it has done? It's meant that you've got the most expensive banks in the world on a PE price to book. Like, that money is not flowing into, as much as it should, into long-term infrastructure, into refining and bringing value added to the mining industry.
Yep.
Into innovation, into technology, into housing, frankly, to lower the cost of living. I mean, there's a number of areas where that capital could go for the 10, 20, 30-year benefit of the country.
Where are we sitting on the whole AI play or quantum, bearing in mind, as you're saying, the Chinese and the Americans and other nationalities are investing so heavily? From your synopsis.
The talents.
Yeah,
there.
the talent might be here, but where are we in terms of actually getting things done?
I think the hard, and here I'll make a broader point than Australia. There's no other country in the world like the US in terms of risk capital. The quantum, and I use it in this regard as size, the size of investment dollars going into venture capital, going into technology, dwarfs everywhere else in the world.
Okay.
Right? And that's a major issue. I think what we see in other ecosystems, be it Europe or Australia, is the ambition of the founders, is just not as high as in the US. Right? So American founders think really, really big, or Aussies or Europeans who move and start their companies in the US. But they genuinely want to build something that is significant, not just in terms of valuation, but in global penetration.
Yep.
And often, I'll use a UK example here. I met a founder in Scotland at the University of Edinburgh.
Okay.
And Edinburgh is a well-regarded university, but it has a particular expertise around AI and satellite and space. And so, really smart PhD, really interesting application. And so, as the conversation progressed, I said, look, where do you want to take this company? And he looked me dead in the eye and he said, look, Rob, I really believe we could probably be the biggest company in Scotland at some stage. And I'm like, fantastic. And that's an extreme case, but that, directionally gives you a flavor of.
And if that was an American sitting in Scotland, what would he or she have said to you?
Yeah, I mean, they start with, we are going to, in our vertical, become, dominant in our relative marketplace. That might be global, that might be the US, but in a big it might be in the Five Eyes countries or whatever, depending on the application, if it's defense. But they're looking for leadership, right? They're looking for global leadership. They're looking for, Now, many of them fail. Many of them don't achieve it. But if you don't start with that ambition, you're not going to grow into that ambition. You've got to start with that ambition, right?
If I have that ambition, Rob, and I'm sitting in Scotland or I'm sitting in somewhere in Australia, and I've got myself a reasonably good team, they are talented, well educated, and exposed to good people, but not all people. Am I going to get access to the necessary capital at the right price?
Yeah. So I think what's changed in the last 15 years is there's a mature first generation venture capital industry in Australia, right? With 4 or 5 well-known brands who are probably on their third, fourth fund, have produced great returns.
Yeah.
So the capital's there. Now, we would argue as an offshore investor, there might be arguably too much of that big end of VC town capital, so valuations tend to be slightly higher.
Yeah, a little bit inflated.
Yeah,
Yep.
a bit inflated.
Well, the whole tech market was inflated quite substantially. It's come off quite dramatically, actually. Yeah,
come back dramatically. So capital, I think capital's part of it. Mentorship is another part of it.
Good point. Yes.
Building a company is really difficult, irrespective of what industry, like your firm, my firm, tech company. It's hard, right? It's really hard.
It is.
And it's a long journey. And people expect instant success. We would typically say it takes 7 to 15 years to build a great company. You may have lots of positive signals along the way.
Yep.
But to really say I've built something great, I think it's 7 to 15 years. Right? And along the way, you're not running. If you're the founder, you're not running one company. You're probably running 4 different ones. You start with 4 or 5 people. You probably know them. They're probably friends.
Yep.
You may have met them at university. Off you go. And then you've got you triple the size, but they're more strangers. A lot of these tech companies, they haven't hired a lot of people. You're in the recruitment business. Even the most sophisticated corporates make mistakes with hiring.
Yes, they do.
Right.
All day long, every day of the week, as we know, right? Absolutely.
Yeah. And they have no money, so they're not using professionals like your firm. They're just sort of using networks, and they get some of it right.
And everyone's drinking the same Kool-Aid all day long as well.
Yeah.
You see a bit of that.
Exactly.
Yep.
But they're probably even at 15 and 20 in the same room.
Yep.
Right?
The risk tolerance is very different.
Yeah. Yep. But then one day, the next stage they get to 50 or 100.
Yes.
And you've got a founder who might be a brilliant scientist, might be technically good, might in their spare time read up about management. But now they have to lead through an organization, multi-layers, right?
Different skill set.
Different skill set, right? So, the founder is doing 3, 4 different jobs, and they can solve it like Zuckerberg by hiring a Sheryl Sandberg.
Yes.
They can solve it by the Google guys sort of going, we're going to do what we're good at, and we're going to hire Eric Schmidt. We're going to hire a professional CEO. There are lots of ways of solving it, but so it's hard enough to build a company out of nothing. It's hard enough to disrupt all your competitors. You then have to build an organization, right? And it's very different managing, passing through a 115-year-old company like CBA and managing a mature organization that has a management culture built over decades, processes built over decades. You can always improve those things. But there's installed base. Starting with a piece of paper, renting your first office, you probably remember what that was like.
Yep.
And you start, and you don't really know whether it's going to work.
Well, the business plan got ripped up about umpteen times so far, right? Never
Yeah,
came to
and
fruition.
normally what happens is things go well, and then you probably extrapolate, and then actually something happens, and you go, actually, maybe we have to recalibrate or bring in some new people. Like that's the journey of building a company, right? It's not linear. It's not straight, to the top right, right?
And it's still a low percent going to make it, right?
Yeah, I think the stat is something like 70% of all new companies fail within 2 to 3 years, and 90% by 5 years.
Yeah.
So, we're in our sixth year. I don't know how long your company is, but, it's definitely older than 5 years.
Yep.
You're sort of by definition in that 10%, right?
That's
Once
right.
you break year 5. So mentorship is, I think, one of the biggest things. And Australia has it, the UK has it, but no one has it in the depth of the American ecosystem. And I think when we think about our firm and how we built our firm, we actually place the greatest value on our operating experience. The fact that we have run businesses, that we have led teams, we have led cultures, we have led performance management, because that's so valuable, right? Money is a commodity. There are lots of people who can write the check. But can you help these founders over the next 5, 10 years as they grow the company? And so, we try and attract as many operators into our business, whether it's at the board, whether it's in the team, whether it's the shareholders, because then we can sort of bring that to bear to people we back.
Thanks for watching the No Limitations podcast, brought to you by Blenheim Partners, board and executive search firm. As a trusted advisor, we work with Australian listed groups, multinational corporations, large private companies, and social impact organisations on their most critical people choices to drive change, prepare for growth, and outperform their peers. To learn more about Blenheim Partners and executive search, visit our website, blenheimpartners.com. And now, back to the show. Rob, who is your company? Because we've just, for the first 20 or 30 minutes so far, we've just solved half the problems of the world, called a few things out, and the audience probably wants to know a little bit about you and what your aim is with Serendipity.
So, Greg, I was a banker for 25 years. I spent half of that time in Europe, half of the time in Asia Pacific, 7 very happy years on the exco of CBA.
Yeah, I remember meeting you in there one day.
Yeah.
Long time ago, yep.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess I got to the stage where I sort of felt either I do another, my next job and probably the rest of my career in banking, or I do something more entrepreneurial. And as I said earlier, we started, my co-founders and I, who happen to both be Aussies, so we're Anglo-Australian firm. We formed this view that we were going into this effectively Cold War over the next few decades. We felt that governments and corporates were going to go through a phase of adopting technologies like AI, quantum, cybersecurity, semiconductors, those kind of technologies at scale, because that imperative to secure the physical technology infrastructure was going to become one of, not the only, but one of the defining issues for the next 2-3 decades. So we set up Serendipity, and what do? We invest in dual purpose, dual use technologies. So that means it can be used for civilian purposes by the private sector, but also by governments, both civilian, non-civilian agencies. So we're very early stage. We'll go in anywhere from seed through to Series A for a first check, and then we'll keep investing. So we're agnostic after we're on the cap table. And we have a heavy focus around security. Right?
Yep.
and the technology might vary, and the medium might vary. So that's what we do. How we do it is, I guess, all of us had invested in funds, and one of the issues with funds is they respond, like we talked about incentives earlier. That model creates an incentive to actually raise a lot of money. Right? You're paid to accumulate assets.
Yep.
Right? But the second thing is, because of the life cycle of a fund, you're incentivized to deploy all the capital in the first 2 or 3 years.
That's right.
And there comes a date where you have to divest.
Yeah.
And typically you're incentivized to divest your best assets. Now,
That's right.
I'm a firm believer that not that many great companies are created globally every year. So if you invest in a great company, logically you'd not want to sell, right? You'd want to keep it. And also, we wanted to be an investment firm, not an asset management firm. So we wanted to be focused on returns, not asset gathering. Okay. So we set up as a permanent capital vehicle. And what that means is we're a company. So when people give us money, they become shareholders. And so going back to the earlier point I made, we only raised money from senior executives who had run effectively critical infrastructure. Now, critical infrastructure could be an energy company, could be a telco, could be financial institutions, could be part of government.
What do you do that for?
Because they know two things. They know how the infrastructure runs, and they know what those companies should buy.
Okay.
So
you're very, very careful about who you choose to invest.
Yeah.
Come and join. Okay.
So we are, because we do invest in dual use, and they do work, some of these companies, probably 30, 40% of the companies work for the intelligence services.
Yep.
We're 92% by equity, 99% by voting, owned by Five Eyes nationals. So we, and the rest, the rest of that ownership is sort of continental Europeans and, a couple of Singaporeans, a couple of Indians, right? So we don't take money from the Middle East. We don't take money from China because we have to go through CFIUS. We have to go through the sort of foreign investment type rules. Those rules are getting tougher, right?
Okay.
But that's also a moat around the business, because there are a lot of people who've taken money from those geographies. There are a lot of people who have spent their last 10, 15 years investing in those countries. And, that's sometimes an issue, getting through these kind of regulations. So that's how we've sort of built the business. The last thing I'd say is, because I came from industries where you couldn't tolerate large degrees of failure, right? So I saw that you had Steve Sargent on your podcast. I was much more junior. I started my career in GE, right? So when you come from a culture where they make aircraft engines, right? Or if you work for a great company like CBA, where the ATMs are always up, largely.
Yes. Then
an industry that embraces 90% failure in its portfolio is just not for you. Right? So we're not what they call a spray and pray investor. We look at about 200 things a year. We do 1 or 2 new things. And we tend to be quite actively involved. We've never had a failure in the history of the firm. Sooner or later we will.
Actively, in your definition, involved means what?
That means, being on the board.
Yeah.
But that probably means talking to the founders several times a week.
Yep.
That means not just advising on strategy and capital raising, but go to market, helping introduce them to companies, helping, drive revenue. There are 2 forms of capital. There's investment capital, but once you're owner of a company, the most attractive form of capital is revenue.
Yep.
Right? And so by having this ecosystem of senior people in the corporate world, we can help open doors
Yep.
to large corporates around the world. So that's sort of the business model. And it's, to date worked well. We have a IRR of, over 27%. And because we're a company, probably the metric we measure ourselves most closely on is net asset value per share. Because we do raise capital and that shows real value creation.
Yes.
And on an annualized basis, since inception, that's around 32, 33%. But, what I learned in my sort of large corporate career is the 80-20 rule really holds, which is a few things create all the value.
Yep.
So when we built this business, we actually designed it not to try and do too much. As in, we've set a maximum of 15 investments, we're at 9. With our model, you're actually incentivized, because every time you raise capital, it's diluted to shareholders.
Yep.
You're incentivized to raise the least amount of capital, not the most amount of capital.
Okay.
Right? But how we make our shareholders money is organic net asset value increase. Right?
How long are you in for?
So we aim to be in for between 7 and 15 years into an investment.
Okay.
Now, clearly they could sell beforehand, but generally that's sort of the hold period.
Mm.
And so,
And that was your definition of success earlier too, wasn't it?
Yeah,
Most countries
and
crack
so
it by
these,
7 or 15.
yeah, exactly. And I think, I would describe where we are as a business is we've finished the first phase, which is you stand up a business, you're building a team, you're building a brand, you're building a franchise, you're demonstrating your early hypotheses work, you're delivering some financial success. But the next phase is actually where you cement your track record. It's very different having a 5-year track record of 27% versus a 10-year track record of 27%.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yep.
So that's where you cement your track record, and then you start to expand the business. So we're headquartered in Singapore,
Yep.
but we just set up our London office in January. I think in 18 months we'll set up our US office, and one day we'd like to have our Sydney office.
We've got to give you some incentive to make sure that happens then, don't we, at the end of the day? Hey, just going back from your days in banking, and I think the last time you and I met, I walked into a very large office and you were CFO at Commonwealth Bank, and well done to you.
Thank you.
What shook you up most, or what did you learn most from going from being that senior executive to that entrepreneur?
Yeah, so I think I'd like to think, that I'm not one of these senior executives that conflated their personal identity with their job. And you see that a lot.
Yep.
You probably see it more than me, but
Yeah,
you see a lot of people, and remaining grounded is really important, right? And so when you're in these big jobs, generally people are really nice to you. And they're not nice to you because maybe they like you. They're nice to you because you're going to be nice to the CFO of the Commonwealth Bank, right?
Yep.
Whoever's in that job.
Correct. Yep.
And it's really important when you're a senior executive, you realize that it's a privilege to do these jobs. But you're just passing through.
That's exactly right. That's right.
And all you can do is your best when you're in the job and hopefully make a contribution and add some value. But all the accolades that come with the CBA, and yes, you played your small role, but that's not you.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So when I set up the business, I knew it would be different.
So just going back to was this over a couple of drinks one night? Was this over a couple of coffees? When did this all come about? Now what's the story behind setting up? That in itself is always a great yarn.
Yeah, I think sort of my career at CBA largely overlapped with Ian Narev's.
That's right. Yep.
And I learned so much. I mean, anyone who joins an executive committee, however good you think you are, however deep your business experience, that's just a different level. And I had the real privilege of doing 3 jobs on that exco. So I was first the group head of strategy, then I ran all the Asian operating businesses and digital banking, and then I became the CFO. And I think at that stage, as I said earlier, you sort of decide, do I want to be a career banker? And what I would say is what the CBA has done so well, the boards of the CBA, is for probably, at least I'm aware of the last 3 CEOs, they've always picked the right person for the right time, from Ralph Norris to Ian to Matt. But, I'd been on Exco nearly 7 years, and Matt's an incredibly capable guy, and he's a young guy. And so you either decide you're going to be that guy who is there for 14, 15 years on Exco, or you sort of decide, am I going to do something different? And for me, I couldn't envisage working for another Australian bank as an executive.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think when you walk, when it's like sport, when you walk into work every day, really proud of your team, wanting your team to win, I couldn't, whatever the role, I couldn't have envisaged working. Not that I don't respect them, but I just didn't want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But then I also, I had a relatively young family. I didn't want to travel the world, move to the UK, try and become CEO there. And then it was also coupled with this, actually, you've had a great banking career. Do you want a second career? Do you want to do something really different? How do you want to spend the next 20 years of your life? And part of it was absolutely something entrepreneurial. But then as my co-founders and I talked about it, as importantly, we thought, look, can you make a difference? Can you do something that's good for the sort of countries, ecosystems we love, right? And national security, defense is really important. And if you go back to 2019, actually, a lot of investors actively would say we would never touch that stuff. Mm. And we were fortunate that we were sort of financially secure. And we could say, look, do something that makes a difference, do something really fun and interesting. Never forget that. And also do something that is lucrative, right?
Yeah, exactly. You're going to spend your time at it. You might as well make a buck out of it.
And that's what we did. And it's the combination of those things. And I have to say, I'm one of these people, I've been really fortunate with my career. I've learned a lot. I've worked for really interesting companies. I would say I would divide my career into two parts. One is the sort of junior years. And that for me was relatively short because I went to GE, I went to McKinsey. Those organizations are great with mobility, great training grounds. They both have performance cultures of up and out. Slightly different styles, but similar organizations. And then after that, I became a relatively senior person. I was global head of corp dev at Barclays. And so the next phase, I've generally been in leadership positions, and they've all been slightly different. And as you know, you mature as a leader. And I really felt my time at CBA, I'd sort of reached, a really great place where, of course, it's very different being a chief executive than a CFO. Mm. But there were enough similarities, right? You're a bit of a public figure. You've dealt with the investors. And I had a sort of slight baptism of fire because my first result as a CFO was about 96 hours after Austrac came out and sort of said that they were going to fine us, right? And so walking into your first result and the cameras are flashing, and basically the hour, luckily for me, I mean, except for presenting the numbers, they didn't want to talk to me. All the questions were towards Ian around what had happened, why it happened, whether he was going to stay or not. And at the time, of course, it wasn't any fun, and it was highly stressful, but great experiences, unique experiences, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I really thought, look, why not do something really entrepreneurial? And I've loved it. And it's just different. It's not better or worse. I mean, I work with the 11 people in the business, right? Day to day,
Okay.
right? My last job, I had a couple of 2,500 people working for me. I think in Asia, I had about 10,000 people working for me, right? But it's great. You get to choose who you work with, right? In big companies, you don't. We have amazing investors who've invested in us.
Was that hard to get the investors to come in, or was it hard to get the?
I mean, to be honest, the first set were all people I'd got to know over the previous 20 years of being a relatively senior people. So there are a lot of people from Australia, a lot of people from the UK, and certain amount from US, Canada.
Yep.
And so, people who basically invested off the idea, but knew me well enough to sort of say, look, I'm going to back you. And then off the back of that, largely, we've never approached someone we don't know and asked them for money. It's actually all come from word of mouth, from effectively that ecosystem.
Okay.
And generally, because of the nationalities, because we want people who can add value to the ecosystem, it tends to be, so the model's really worked well because successful people, generally their social circle tends to be other successful people, So that's how we've sort of built out the business. So we have 115 shareholders globally.
Okay.
And it's worked well, I mean, the one thing that you have to adjust to when you set up your own business is your company's brand doesn't hold any value. So how you create traction is always off your CV or your co-founder's CVs.
Yep.
Right. But then one day, I think it was probably after 2.5, 3 years, suddenly you meet someone and you're so used to saying, almost starting up slightly apologetic, you haven't heard of us, but I used to do this or whatever. And one day you say, you haven't heard of us, Serendipity Capital, and they go, of course I've heard of you.
Good feeling. Good feeling.
And that's a brilliant feeling, right?
Yep.
And one thing I would say about building a small company, I mean, you've been through it, is you start in a small office with 4 people.
You sure do.
Right?
That's right.
And you all sat around, and then one day you upgrade, and they're like,
Yep.
And then a year ago, we just signed our first sort of 6-year lease. Right. And as I said, we opened London. And when you're in a big company, those events, if someone says you're moving office, you're just like, that's a pain. When it's your company, you're like, this is such an exciting moment, right? Like, because every little bit there's no franchise. All the value, all the traction is created by you, your colleagues and you walking into work, and everything you're doing is a first.
So how do you sell yourself? I know you said you've gone to people that you know, right? But as you say, they also position themselves with others who are pretty smart at the same time. What's the point of differentiation? Because at the end of the day, you're not selling a widget.
Yeah, so
You're selling a strategy, which is invisible. Okay, it's on paper. There's a bit of historically, there's a track record, but I've got to buy a lot of you, don't I?
Yeah, so I would say there's sort of 3 things people are buying. One is the thematics. I mean, I think most sophisticated, globally aware people absolutely know we're at this really interesting moment in time.
Sure are.
The geopolitics, the global macroeconomics, and most of them also understand these technologies are really important, right? And so however successful they are, even if they have a portfolio career, most of them don't really get to spend time with a group of people who this is the only thing we do. We only invest in quantum and AI and defense tech and national security. So people are really interested, right? So often people, they would never say this publicly, but they would say, I'm doing 6 things, but this is the most fun. This is the most interesting. I'm doing a lot of much more prestigious things, but this is the one I really get intellectually challenged on, right? I think the second thing is they are buying the team, right? You have to have trust. If you're giving people money, you have to trust their judgment. You've got to trust that they're going to invest well. But the third thing is, I mean, if you look at our board, I've always built the company based on the company we want to become, not what we are.
Okay.
So our chairman, Ewan Stevenson, was the CFO, former head of European investment banking for Credit Suisse, CFO of Royal Bank of Scotland, CFO of HSBC. We've got Dame Ruth Carney, who's the chairperson of Babcock International, second biggest defense company in the UK. We've got Steve Roders, our audit chair, who is chair of KPMG Asia, and then CFO of Manulife. So investors also get comfort with that, right? That these guys, they might be a small firm, a young firm, they're building a governance model that is world-class, that the board and the investment committee, the majority of that is independents, not executives. They get comfort from the fact that, our auditors are KPMG, our tax accountants are PwC, our lawyers are Clifford Chance. Now, when you build a firm like that, you're running slightly higher costs than if you have less sophisticated advisors. But again, we built it on the basis of where do we want to be in year 10? Where do we want to be in year 15? Right? And if you want to build a great firm, you need world-class governance. You need world-class auditors, suppliers. So and I think that gives people comfort. The last thing I would say is for our share investors, we're transparent. I mean, we report 4 times a year, but our annual report, we base on public market disclosure.
Okay.
So what does that mean? Of course, it's 50 pages long. There's lots of financials. But it also means we disclose the compensation of the board, the compensation of all the all the partners, including their shareholdings. So if you give KKR money, do you know how much your fund manager is paying himself? No, but our investors know exactly how much we're paying ourselves. Right?
Is that important? And is that important? Do you think if you're giving me a great return, do I really? I know your argument there against KKR, and it's a good point you've raised, but is it important, or is that just the point of difference?
So what I would say is, I've sort of thought about it from the lens of, if I was giving someone money, what would I like to see? Right? So treat others as you would like to be treated. Right? And that's broader than just disclosure. The 3 founders have invested $40 million of their own money in the business, right? US dollars, right? Mm-hmm. So we don't expect people to give us money unless we invest heavily ourselves, right? We're not playing with other people's money. So I think treating people as you would want to be treated, right, is really important. And I think the last thing, and this is a bit of a glib comment, is our job is to give them the transparency. If they just look at the statement and don't read it, that's up to them, right? I'm fine with that. But I also think that most people, you've hit on a really important point. Most people are happy while things go up.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Right? And they don't ask any questions. The day something goes down, they're really unhappy. And I understand that. But therefore, we place, like, one thing we can't guarantee is into perpetuity. We won't have a bad investment. We won't have a bad year. No one can guarantee that.
Yep.
So I'm a big believer when things are going well, be transparent, explain your decisions, explain your motivations, explain how you're paid, explain, and our compensation, my compensation is not set by me, even though I'm the biggest shareholder in the firm. It's set by the board, right? All of those things are important because sooner or later, you're going to have a bad day. And when you have a bad day, do your investors look at you and go, look, I get it. It happens. Or do they say, look, you haven't been transparent. We don't understand what you guys are doing. Aren't managing risks, right, as well as you should be. Now, if something happens, we will have to relook and say, where did we make the mistake? Why did we make the mistake? But, I think there's a real obligation that comes with managing other people's money.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
Hey, Rob, just out of interest, you're dealing in one of the most interesting times in the product that you've chosen to deal in. How do you decipher between those who are going to make it and those who don't? I know you obviously got specialists, etc.
Yeah.
But I've just got to think, bearing in mind, the amount of investment that's going to go into defence just in the US alone is going to be enormous. You already touched on NATO.
Yeah.
They're miles behind, so they've got to stand up. Russia's going to stand up and start taking. China is already building, I think, ratio 6-1 in ships against the Americans. The world is in a big play here. Then you've got the technologies behind it and ahead of it, etc.
Yeah.
I mean, you couldn't have chosen a better place to build a business in, but how do you decipher all this?
So you've always got to triangulate, right? Because particularly when you're investing really early, you're trying to assess the market. You're trying to assess the product that they want to build, right? Effectively, and you can do that through, we've got scientists in our ecosystem.
Yeah.
So the chair of nanotechnology at Oxford Physics Department, Oxford University, is a senior advisor. People like that.
Mm-hmm.
So you can get that scientific input. You can, this ecosystem is really important because we have people who have purchased technology on behalf of governments, right? That kind of national security defense tech kind of thing. Okay. We have a lot of people in the private sector who have also bought technology. So we can triangulate what we think the market demand is, irrespective of the founder. But the reality is, when you're investing really early, the defining judgment is the founder, right?
Interesting.
Because even when all of that other stuff checks out, you may, after 2 or 3 years, have to pivot slightly, the business model or the product focus or whatever. And what you're really trying to work out is this person, have they got the vision? Have they got the tenacity, the resilience, right? When things go bad, are they going to give up? Or are they going to power through?
Yeah.
Now, although we haven't had a failure yet, I mean, again, into perpetuity, sooner or later we'll have a failure. But I think you can take a lot of the risk out, right? Not the risk that a company fails after 5 to 10 years, but the kind of risk that the company fails after like 15 months or 22 months because something's so blatantly wrong, right? As in, either the founder's not right or the product's interesting, conceptually interesting, but no one's going to buy, right? Those kind of risks, you can, reduce them at least. So that's the model. And I think our model, there are 2 parts to it. One is, I'm sure you've been an equity owner in businesses, and you've also been an LP in funds. people feel very differently when they own a business,
Sure do.
and positively, as in they're proud.
Mm.
They tell their friends, they talk about it at dinner parties. Much lesser extent when you're LP, right? And so by having this model, this corporate model where we're investing off balance sheet, we've got a really passionate group of shareholders who really do want to help, and they want to actually, we treat them like owners. They are owners and they want to be seen as owners of the business. And so you get a lot of help. And if we were a normal fund, we could not afford to have those 115 people, right, as sort of senior advisors or paid, advisors to the firm.
Yeah, right.
So we've got a depth of capability. We just, for a firm of our size, we just couldn't. The model wouldn't work as a 2% management fee firm. And the last thing I'd say about our model is, I should have said it early, we do have a management fee of 2%, but we don't charge a performance fee. So we have a really strong equity culture, whereas the senior people all invested their capital, and the more junior members, sometimes they do invest their own capital, or we give them equity when they join. Because the best risk management culture you can have in a firm is when everyone feels they own it.
That's 100%. Yeah.
Right? Because then people aren't, even at the analyst level, they're not playing with someone else's money. They're like looking at the share price going, I want to, if I'm working on an investment, I want this one to work. So we have that alignment between our management team and our external investors, which is really important. There's no way we as an executive team can make money and our shareholders don't make money.
Totally aligned.
Yeah.
What's your greatest risk?
When you're running a business, it's always going to be hubris, right? It's always going to be, culture is so important. You've always got to keep that level of collaboration. Hopefully performance keeps going the way it does. But as it does, humility around you're only as good as your next investment, understanding not to stretch. Humans are designed for growth, right? And so one of the issues is people, when they become successful, they sometimes grow too quickly.
Very true.
They expand too quickly, and then mistakes start happening. So just, keeping the operating model consistent, keeping the culture consistent. And sort of my job as chief executive is making sure I keep, the team grounded. And of course, the board and my chairman making sure I'm grounded, because you want to keep the best elements of success whilst avoiding hubris. And, I think again, this weekend, we've had Warren Buffett step down. I mean, he's a poster child for long-term investing.
Absolutely.
Very thoughtful, but very little hubris.
In terms of, can you just give us an idea of the size of the scale of the potential market that you're looking to invest in, and the amount of money being poured into these new technologies across everything from defense through to a startup in some company which could flog its technology?
So, yeah, that's a good question. It's hard to define. What I would say is, if you just take quantum, because that number I've seen recently, McKinsey, their latest report said by 2033, the quantum market globally is $2 trillion, worth $2 trillion, right? You've got to believe AI is a multiple of that by 2033.
Yep.
Right? And then there's some overlap between AI and quantum. There'll be some overlap between defense tech and quantum and AI. But you have to believe that defense technology must be in the hundreds of billions between now and 2033. Right? So these are really large markets. I think as a firm, we're $500 million firm.
Okay.
And I think, can we see ourselves getting to $1 billion, $2 billion? Sure. But our strategy will probably be to get to a certain level and shrink the size of the firm. Because with venture capital, getting too large actually leads to negative selection. Right. And I'll use SoftBank as an example. So, a groundbreaking event in the history of venture capital is when they set up the Vision Fund, which was $100 billion. Right? Which is great. And they made 2% management fee on that money. The problem with it is you can't write $5 million checks.
Yeah, true.
Not when you're 100, right? You're forced to find companies where you can write not even 100 million. You've got to very quickly, over 2 or 3 rounds, write $1 billion. And that just leads to negative selection. That leads to deploying too much capital. Right? Because actually building a business, being slightly capital constrained, is not a bad thing. I mean, often when we're talking to real sort of pre-seed, seed level startups, and the founder will say, look, I'd like to raise 20 million. And I'll say to them, do you need 20 million? They'll say, I think I need 20 million. And so I said, look, tell me what $20 million is. And they'll sort of look at me and I'll say, okay, so in your lifetime, what's the largest check that's ever been deposited in your bank account?
Yeah.
What is the largest purchase you've ever made? Right. So you've got 5 people, you want $20 million. How are you going to spend that money? And often when people raise that much money, they waste it. Right? Because even spending money productively in a startup context is a learned behavior. Right? So size for size sake is not an ambition of our firm. Returning capital. So we have a multiple on invested capital since inception of 2.4x. We think it's going to get to 5 to 6x within 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Now, today, if you look at venture capital funds of a similar duration, so 5 years, right? That duration. The top deciles at 1.6x. We believe we're going to gap out because we're investing in these thematics that have structural tailwinds.
Yeah, okay, right.
And some of these firms have portfolios that have structural headwinds because they invested in 2020, 2021 in blockchain, in crypto, in NFTs, right?
Yep.
But we want to keep those metrics super high. And we'd rather dividend out half the market cap or 2/3 of the market cap of the firm than actually just get bigger and bigger and bigger, because then we fall into a trap. To move the needle, we've got to write a $50 million check.
Right.
Maybe the company only needs 15. Right.
Yep.
So that's a sort of always a complex dynamic. And when we set up the firm, we tried to design the incentives that we're not incentivized to just grow the headline metrics.
Okay. That's a significant difference to most of them, isn't it?
Yeah. But as I said, the world didn't need another venture capital firm run exactly the same way, investing in exactly the same things. So it's no different from us as the companies we invest in. We had to think about, what is the market? Are we a relative fast mover in that market? Are we designing a product that's unique versus, there are some very well-established, world-famous venture capital firms, Sequoia, Lightspeed, So you've got to be offering something different.
Robert, with all the increase in the private markets in our country called Australia, ASX isn't growing.
Yeah.
What do you see happening in the next, I don't know, decade?
Yeah, so I think that's a problem. I think that's a problem largely because of access. That it's really high net wealth individuals who have access consistently to private markets, whereas really anyone, directly or indirectly, can invest in the public markets. And if we want to build societies where we have less social friction, not just economically, but increasingly between generations, right? We've got to create equal access, right? So a lot of firms are, regulation is evolving, particularly in the US, and firms are trying to access retail and mid-market consumers with private assets. Right?
Okay, right. Yeah.
So that's starting to happen. But the real issue is why are companies deciding to stay private? Why are companies delisting? Because although I said I loved my executive career and I loved being CFO of a publicly listed company, it is a very complex environment now. There are a very broad set of stakeholders that you're accountable to. I would say a couple of things are happening. The risks have gone up. The liabilities have gone up. Compensation has, on a relative basis, it may have looked like it's flat, but post-inflation, post-responsibility is probably significantly down. And it's sort of a bit of a thankless job. And probably the most controversial thing I'll say is most business people, they love what they do. They love business. They're passionate about their customers. They're passionate about building a great company. They love their employees. They're not trying to solve every social problem that exists in the world.
Yeah, very true.
And when you're in a private company, you just get on with it. Right? You can do all of that first 4 or 5 things without the last thing. And I think it's become really unattractive for a lot of executives. And going back to people like KKR and so on, they can hire the best executives.
Absolutely.
They're quite happy to leave public company firms and they can focus on their job. And if they deliver, they will get rewarded at a level which would be deemed socially unacceptable in a public company setting.
That's exactly right.
Right. So it's a big problem.
Do you see it changing? Or do you see increasing more now towards private?
I thought there was a phase where it could change. I think I guess the US have always managed to pay their public market executives very well. Right? So the US, but I think in Europe, you'd know better than me, but my impression in Australia, it's a big problem.
Enormous problem.
And
You've hit on
I
the head
just
really
think
well.
about when I moved to Australia, the currency as well. It was, in 2012, I think by 2012, it was 110 to the US dollar, it's 63 cents.
Correct.
So the ability to attract, international executives.
Completely down at the moment. Absolutely.
Yeah,
And you
it's
can't blame
really
people.
Yep. Yeah, it's really difficult. So I can't see that. I can't see that changing. And I think this is why you're starting to see the explosion of private markets. And a lot of, poster child OpenAI, $300 billion company, private, no ambitions to go public. Now, maybe that's not the right valuation, but it's a big company. Right? Even at half that, it's a big company.
Yep.
So I think a lot of people are like, do we need to go public at all? And now all the funds are raising bigger and bigger private capital. You can get capital without going public. So I think you're going to see capital markets continue to shrink potentially, unless investors take a step back and say, look, we want these companies to be public.
Why would they want them to be public? Is that because of the governance is guaranteed, or not necessarily guaranteed, but more rigorous? But this day and age, as you said, you're self-governing.
Yeah, I think it's a fallacy to say only public companies have good governance. I think there are companies with good governance, and they might be public or private, and there are companies with bad governance.
Yep.
But what public markets do, which is unique, is it provides daily liquidity.
Yes.
That's highly attractive, right? And that's ultimately, and I'm not talking about the individual, I'm talking about the big super funds, the people who dictate these policies. Yes. They ultimately have to sit there and make a trade-off, right? Because it's their view on all these social issues and compensation.
Yes.
Right, that's driving. Not to pick on Australia, it's the same with the US, it's the same with Europe. They're driving this dynamic of, do I really want to go public? Or if I'm public, maybe I should take that buyout offer.
Correct. Yeah, interesting. Social issues starting to disappear?
I think so. If definitely in the US, right? DEI.
Yep.
Those kind of issues are off the agenda. And where Europe ends up, where Australia ends up, let's see. But I'm not saying I'm not saying there's no place for that. But again, all these things are not black and white issues, right? And I think they've been turned into black and white issues.
Yep.
And that creates first order, second order, third order problems, right?
So as a banker and as someone who's across all these markets, the world is, standing back watching where every leader gets out of bed in the morning now and probably reads the paper or reads their phone in 30 seconds of what's Donald Trump done. Okay, so the game's changed somewhat. On economic theory and policy, bearing in mind he's got a pretty good secretary that he brought in as well. What do you think of the long-term strategy? Is he going to get caught out between the lag of investment to turn to returns, or is he going to get enough investment and confidence in to get the markets for him going the right way? What are you, just standing back looking at it, what are your thoughts?
I think it's hard. I don't know, right? I think it's clear what they're trying to do, right? And I would characterize it as clearly bring massive industrial investment into the economy, right, at scale.
Yep.
And part of that is employment, part of that is security of supply chains, but I think there's a second aim that Scott Bessent is definitely trying to do, which is to lower the price of the 10-year bond.
Yep.
And that's both short and long term. Short-term imperative is I think they've got $8-9 trillion that they have to refinance this year. And doing that at 3.5 versus 4.5, creates enormous value to the US economy.
Yeah.
But medium term, having that 10-year somewhere between 2.5 and 3.5 actually helps the industrial investment proposal. And by that, I mean tariffs give the incentive, right? It's the stick.
Yep.
The carrot is if you're modeling building an industrial plant for Toyota, and it's going to take you 5 to 7 years to build.
Yep. You're
running your DCF Excel spreadsheet. You're putting in a price of the 10-year bond. You're going to borrow that money in US dollars.
Yep.
The output of that IRR is completely different at 2.5 versus 4.5.
Sure.
Right? So I think it's very clear what they're trying to do. The problem is whether it's intentional, whether it's not, there's enormous volatility at the moment. Because they're putting on tariffs, then they took them off, then they put them on again.
Yep.
They probably put tariffs on a much broader set of countries than anyone expected. They're talking about trade deals daily. What is my sort of glass half full view is that they do announce 2 or 3 trade deals with major industrial countries.
Well, that's got to be the plan, surely, to goodness, right? That's
India, South Korea, Japan,
Yep.
in the next 60 days.
Yep.
I think if those are genuinely attractive deals that demonstrate that it's not just theory, that they can pull off trade deals that actually support that agenda, then, I think markets might start to react. If they don't, then I think it's going to remain volatile. But I would like to think that they are going to do that. Where I think they're spot on is it is a massive market. For certain industrial companies, it isn't optional. They can't say, okay, we're not going to sell into the US.
Yep.
So they're going to have to find a way. And, what they're saying is quite simple. You build a factory, you don't pay tariffs, right? So
you can go back to your incentive strategy again.
Yeah. So that, but the second thing is, even as individuals, right? People can say, look, I'm really worried about the States. I'm really unhappy. I'm going to not hold so many dollars. I'm not going to invest. There's no country in the world on a risk-adjusted basis, even today, where you could put as much capital in as the US. Where are you going to put it? Right?
Exactly right.
China, Japan, France, UK, right? So, at the end of the day, a lot of this is on all sides negotiation. Because where are the biggest companies in most industries? The US.
Yep.
Where are the most liquid markets in the world? The US.
Yep.
Right. So I know people sort of say this is the break that will change everything. I just think if you're an Indonesian billionaire, your biggest investments are in Indonesia. When you're looking around the world, are you suddenly going to go, oh, I'm short the US, I'm going to put everything into Austria? I mean, that is not happening, right? Whatever people say.
So what's going to be the outcome for China?
Look, I think it's tough. I mean, again, the data is not transparent there.
No, it's not, but not all things are rosy.
I think they're probably much worse than people think they are. I'm quite hawkish on China, as you would expect.
Yep.
I think the GDP numbers are definitely lower than the 5%.
Got to be, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, there was some very good analysis comparing tax receipts and the GDP numbers, and they were moving in completely opposite directions. I think there will be social tensions. And I think it's really hard for them because it's not just China, but in most people who sort of today would say, I have a more nuanced view on the US, right? Or slightly negative view.
Yep.
I think most of them are avoiding the fact that what people want to do is make money out of China, but spend their social life in the West. Right?
Yep.
So I think it's highly likely in the next 2 years, the number of Chinese nationals in US universities is going to significantly reduce. The last numbers I saw, there are 250,000 Chinese nationals at US universities. And the number I saw was 459 Americans in Chinese universities.
Okay, right.
So any kind of reciprocal leveling up, it's going to fundamentally change that. And I think this administration will execute against that.
Yeah, okay.
And so the real issue, I think, for Xi is you've probably got 200, 300 million people in China who have benefited from hanging out in Sydney and San Francisco and Paris and going shopping in London. And if that all gets closed off, I think that's going to cause a lot of tensions, because I think while that's open, people are like, fine, China's fantastic. We're going to compete with you. We're going to win. As long as I can buy real estate in Mossman, as long as I can send my kid to Harvard,
yes,
and I can go on holiday in the south of France. I think if it's like you're going to spend the next 40 years of your life in Chengdu and Shanghai and Guangzhou, I'm not sure how they keep it all together.
so is
I mean,
India?
that's the difference, right?
It is.
No one we know really spends a lot of time outside of potentially a business trip in China.
India going to be the big winner?
I think India is a massive winner. India is a massive winner. I think the US is a massive winner. I think if Canada, my wife's Canadian, I spend quite a bit of time there. I think Canada and Australia should be massive, massive, massive winners out of this, as long as the long-term strategies, the long-term policies, the long-term investments are there. And also they embrace a slightly more dynamic, low-tax environment.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure about Europe.
I think they're going to get left behind with it. They're going to get left behind if they don't watch themselves, don't they?
I think so. And in UK growing up, we always used to say we're sort of young Americans, right? But I think that analogy is increasingly breaking down. But the risk for Australia is you become young Europeans. And so a lot of the mistakes we made in Europe, high tax, too much immigration.
Yep.
I mean, I'm a product of immigration, but immigration at appropriate levels where people integrate is a wonderful thing. Immigration at levels where people don't integrate is the most dangerous thing for a cohesive society. And there's a real risk in Europe they're on the wrong side of it. I don't think Australia is, but those are the things that, looking at Europe, sitting in Australia, that, there are a lot of mistakes Europe made over 20 years that Australia should and, hopefully will avoid.
You haven't mentioned old home, UK.
Yeah, I mean, UK, look, we've elected a very high tax,
I know.
Government that is openly criticizing wealth. And you may have seen the stats. I think in the last 2 years, we've lost something like 25,000 millionaires. I mean, that's a lot.
Yeah, people forget those people employ people normally as well.
At best, they employ people. At worst, they spend a lot of money.
Yeah.
But the myth that wealthy people don't invest, don't consume, don't contribute is just wrong. And I think the stat is for every millionaire that leaves, it's something like, that's the equivalent of 30 basic taxpayers. They're sort of on an aggregate tax level, right? That's what you have to make up. So I think it's an issue. What I would say is the UK have 3 of the top 10 universities in the world. It's got 12 of the top 20 universities in Europe. It's got a long history of engineering excellence, right? So in this new world we're moving into...
Well, Germany had a long history of engineering excellence, didn't they?
Yeah.
They've slipped. Yeah, we're going. Yep.
Yeah, so you can... But I think we talked about this earlier. I mean, complacency is the... Past success does not mean future success, right? So the UK has all these assets. Fantastic history. But it's got some real headwinds, and I think strong leadership will really help, right? Long-term planning, long strategy, attracting investment. and consistency. You made that point. So the challenges for a lot of countries are the same. And I'm slightly biased. I mean, on the day that Australia had its election, Singapore also had its election. And Singapore is, a fantastic success story of 50 years of long-term strategy, long-term planning, real investment in infrastructure. And it's not perfect, but they really understand incentives, taxes, bringing global businesses, talented people to bear. They've actually got a very strict immigration policy, but similar to what I think Australia had 20 years ago, which is if you can add value to the country, you are welcome. But if you can't, it's probably not the right place for you. And Singapore is very much there. So I think, it's a complex place we find ourselves. The last thing I would say, though, is you'll recall in the late 80s, early 90s, late 90s, when the Japanese economy blew up.
Oh, yeah.
And everyone's like, the Japanese economy's blown up, right? It's a massive issue. In the last 20 years, if you went to Japan, life goes on. Everyone's smiling, food's amazing. So all these countries will be there, right? Like, things happen in cycles. The only issue for Europe is it structural or cyclical? It should be cyclical. But if they're not careful, it'll be structural. What does structural mean? Structural means that in 1901, Argentina and Uruguay were two of the top 4 richest economies in the world.
That's right, yeah.
They're not anymore, right? So for the UK, for France, for Germany, for Italy, for Spain, economies that are firmly in the top 15 economies in the world. Good policy, it'll be cyclical. Bad policy, there's a danger, because what happened to Latin America was not just government, governance, economy. It's also waves of technology. All those conditions are present today.
Which are the countries now then we should be looking at and observing and watching really closely? Obviously, you said India, we all know that. Obviously the US and China, but what are the real special ones that maybe we haven't paid attention to?
I think Japan, very similar, very different, but at some level, very similar to Australia. So if you envisage a world of alliances, call it Five Eyes, NATO in some form, but Quad, right?
Yeah.
Quad's really important. Japan also has stuff that those ecosystems need. They have a lot of industrial technologies, manufacturing capabilities that are pivotal for supply chain in a world where you're not using China. Right. So, and I think, Japan is starting to rearm.
Oh, very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so.
So I think Japan's really interesting. Right. And I think India is a big winner, but Japan's a really big winner. And particularly in a world where the US might not be the sole provider of defense capability in the South China Sea. Australia, Japan, India become, the most important countries in this part of the world, right? And this part, not just Singapore, Australia, right?
2 last questions. This podcast is about leadership. We've talked global leadership and global players, but you get to assess a lot of companies, a lot of organizations, startups every day, not every day of the week, but in a large volume. Would you say circa 200 plus per annum? What is a leader to you?
I think it's a unique role because you have to set the vision. You've got to set the strategy. But you also have to build a top team. You've got to be able to delegate. I think a real quality that I've learned about myself is you've got to become self-aware as well, right? And as you design top teams to think about what you're not good at, right? Surround yourself with people, right, that round you out, right? And building an environment where you can align people around a common goal. What comes with, around a goal, setting operating metrics, performance metrics, and then also accountability. Accountability is really important. And I think it's the combination of those things that, as a leader, you have to deliver. But the most important thing, I think, is most people have all of those. People who get to the top, they're complex selection processes. And generally, people are pretty good at a lot of that stuff. I think the self-awareness, the best leaders I've worked with have that. They can do everything else, but they have that. And it's really tough when you're a leader, right? Because everyone is also giving you positive feedback.
Absolutely. Like you said, everyone's very nice to you.
Yeah. So, again, it happens with companies, it happens with leaders, right? Hubris. Knowing your own limitations.
Couldn't agree more. Rob, if you're going to look back at that young man starting his career or having that interview at GE all those years ago, looking back now, what advice would you give to young Rob?
I think it's a really interesting question. And I sort of address it two ways. One is, I think the advice would be, in life, when you get opportunities, take a risk. There's always, so much, and you would have heard this a lot from, people. A lot of leaders, will say about their careers, when you look back, it all looks very logical. It all looks like a natural progression. But there's a heavy dose of luck, right?
Yeah, I agree.
Who do you meet? What doors get opened? You get opportunities. Do you say no or yes? And it's a journey. And the real advice I'd say, look, it's a journey. Enjoy the journey. You only live once, right? So you've got to enjoy what you do, who you do it with. Life's too short.
On that, Rob, thank you very much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks a lot for the opportunity. Thanks, Greg.
You've been listening to No Limitations.